Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Chatham House Middle East and North Africa webinar with three distinguished guests. My name is Sanam Vakil. I'm the director of Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here to a discussion with key experts who I'll introduce momentarily, and we're going to be talking about whether Gulf countries can balance or how they're getting on in balancing regional security dynamics at this key moment in the Middle East with a lot of balancing, juggling underway. Before we get started and before I introduce our panel today, let me sort of just remind you all that we would like this to be interactive and really keen to hear your questions and comments. So please feel free to drop those into the Q&A function, and in about half an hour, we're going to turn to those questions and comments and get started. This discussion is on the record and it is being live streamed. So please bear that in mind as well. So I'm really lucky and really pleased to have three colleagues and experts who I respect deeply with us today for this important discussion. And I'd like to introduce them, just reading some highlights of their bios. They're all very well known, very well published, active also on Twitter and social media, so you should certainly follow them. Firstly, I have Dr. Abdelkhalik Abdullah, who is a senior fellow with the Middle East Initiative at Harvard's Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He is a UAE national, a retired professor of political science, member of Emirati thinkers, and a member of the Executive Council of the Gulf Forum. Dr. Abdelkhalik has had a long and an illustrious career, a prolific writer, and he's contributed lots of books and articles that are really worthy of publication. One that has recently come out, and of course I'm going to ask him to discuss it a bit today, is a relatively new piece called The Gulf Moment and the Making of the Khaliji State. So please check that out if you haven't read it. Secondly, I have Yasmin Farouk, who is a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute Edward P. Jerigian Center for Middle East. Yasmin is also a non-resident, has been a non-resident also at Carnegie, or visiting scholar at Carnegie Endowment, excuse me, and she has over 15 years of experience as a researcher and practitioner of international relations and governance in the Middle East. Yasmin has also published quite prolifically in a number of journals and is really well known on a number of issues, but to me in particular in her understanding of Gulf foreign policy and Saudi foreign policy, and she has a number of important articles coming out, and maybe she will share them in the chat as well. And last and certainly not least, we're joined by Dr. Badr Al-Saif, who is an associate fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. Badr is also an assistant professor at Kuwait University, a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and also has his own consulting firm. Badr specializes on Arabian Peninsula geopolitics, public policy, culture, transnational trends, gender studies, and he's also a leading voice on Kuwaiti politics, and was a deputy chief of staff to a former prime minister of Kuwait. As well, he has been a consultant in the office of Tony Blair. Badr is very active as a writer and contributor as well. He's working on I'm sure, a really interesting piece on what he calls the Kuwaiti model, as Kuwait is undergoing an important domestic transition. And of course, if you're not following him on Twitter, he writes very, really compelling tweets that brings it all together in less than a minute, which is exactly what we need in today's world where we have very short attention spans, myself above all. Welcome to all of you. And again, let me thank you for your time. To get us sort of started, obviously, we all are following regional dynamics. I think hourly, there have been a huge amount of developments over just the past week. And I don't even know, from which geography to begin. We have a new government here in the UK. Obviously, politics in the United States is very much shifting. Prime Minister Netanyahu has just made a speech, his fourth speech at US Congress. And of course, regional states, particularly the Gulf states, are in the middle of a regional security crisis. The war in Gaza continues 9 months on. There is no plan on the table for the day after. Discussions continue to circulate. New ideas keep emerging with regards to security. The issue of Palestinian statehood really still remains undeveloped. There seems very little support from the Israeli political landscape. Hostages are still being held in Gaza. The Chinese are trying to mediate perhaps between Palestinian factions. The Houthis have launched a drone on Tel Aviv. Israel has responded. We've seen kinetic action of significant proportion between Israel and Iran over the past number of months. And of course, there have been also serious tensions between Hezbollah and Israel, and we keep going up and down in anticipating whether the war is going to spread or whether it can be contained. These are just some highlights. I think it's been an extraordinarily difficult period to kind of navigate. And I'm really keen to hear from each of you how you see things developing for Gulf states. I mean, on the one hand, we call them Gulf states, but each Gulf state has its own national identity, national priorities, national interests. How are the Gulf states managing in this very difficult, profound moment? Dr. Abdelkhalik, let me start with you. I mean, also you've written this manuscript. It's very interesting and it's provocative, and you're putting forward this idea that this is the Gulf moment. But in this manuscript, you're also, I think, quite directly laying out the opportunities and scenarios for the Arab Gulf states, but challenges as well, one of them being regional security. So how do you see this as an analyst of the Gulf, as someone who has been watching and evaluating Gulf politics for quite some time? How are things progressing from your vantage point?
Well, thank you very much, Sanam, for the generous introduction and for having me in this session. I'm so happy to share it also with the dear colleagues, Yasmin and Badr, Yasmin from Paris and Badr from Kuwait. And thank you also for mentioning my latest Harvard paper on the Gulf moment. I firmly believe that this is the Gulf moment, whereby these 6 Arab Gulf states are today the center of activity, center of diplomacy, center of politics in the whole region. I believe that, and I have written it time and again, and I emphasize it. And because of that, I think one of the things that attracts my attention to these countries is that they have been very good at balancing different rivals and balancing regional and global, to that matter, dynamics. They have been very good at it. They have learned the art of it. And I think they managed to maintain good relationship between Iran, between Israel, on the global front, the same thing, China, America, Russia. So to answer your question directly, I think they have been very good reaching out to everybody. When they normalized relationship with Israel, they made it clear that normalization is not a threat to Iran, and they will not allow Israel to use their spaces, their land, their whatever, the normalization to target Iran. So they have been very clear on that, and Iran understands that. That's why Iran has accepted the fact that Israel now is having a good relationship with at least 2 Arab Gulf states, and maybe in the future even more. Having said this, I think it's not also a secret that the Arab Gulf states have been doing their best to de-escalate in the region for the past 2, 3 years now, since 2021, after COVID-19. And even lately, because of all these things that you just mentioned, the latest escalation, you see that Qatar, the Arab Gulf states, Qatar, has been very active, extremely active, trying to bring some kind of a ceasefire in Gaza. That's one role. That's very positive. People really are not appreciating how hard that kind of a role is. That's Qatar. UAE also, for its own part, is doing a whole lot to adjust to the day after this war. And they have been engaging with Israel, with the United States, with others, convincing everybody to come in to do their part when it comes to security, when it comes to the politics of it, when it comes to the relief of it. So I think in general, the Arab Gulf states are doing their best to de-escalate, to keep the region quiet. And I don't think it is all doom and gloom. There are a lot of things happening there, and in many parts of the Arab world and in the Gulf, it's also business as usual, Sana.
Thank you, Dr. Abdelkhalik. Good to hear that you see things not as all doom and gloom, and I think we all need a bit of positivity. And so, I would like to come back to you and draw out, where the bright lights are going forward, and how we can sort of build on those bright lights. But let me have you think about that for a minute, and let me turn to Yasmin. Thank you for being here. And again, you have a broad array of expertise following the region. So you're welcome to take this opening question as you wish. Of course, you have been writing quite a bit on Saudi Arabia. So if you want to kick off and also reflect on how Saudi Arabia in particular is handling this moment, and how, if at all, Saudi Arabia is trying to balance Israeli pressure, Iranian pressure dynamics with Washington, and also its domestic priorities. That is also interesting for me, but I think also for everyone on this call.
Great. Thank you so much, Sanam, and thank you for putting me in a panel with my dear friend Badr and with Dr. Abdelkhalik, whom I follow the work in Arabic as well. So any Arabic speakers should also read his work, especially as an Egyptian. I never got an opportunity to discuss this, but I really appreciate your work. I would say, Sanam, that when it comes to the Gulf, there has been, to me, since October 7th, two constants in their and how they are dealing with the crisis. One is shielding what Dr. Abdelkhalik called their de-escalation efforts of the previous 2 to 3 years. And it has been working for them. When it comes to intra-Gulf dynamics, whether intra-GCC dynamics or GCC-Iran dynamics or GCC-Iraq dynamic, or that triangle, or even with Yemen, I believe the number one priority, including for Iran, as per the Saudi foreign minister himself, was to keep that detente going in the Gulf region, right? So that has been the first constant for all of them, to allow to contain the rebounds of the war in Gaza. Two is in their relationships outside the Gulf. Meaning the relationship with the US, the relationship with Israel itself, or the relationship with China, or the relationship with Europe. There hasn't been really any cost put for the difference in political positions when it comes to the crisis itself. So Gulf countries, and again, it's sometimes too simplistic to put them all together, but they do have positions in common, and they have expressed this in creating a coordination group that has some, large principles that they all agree on. They differ on the strategies, they differ on the people that are going to implement this, but there are some big elements they agree on. But it is clear that their capacity to achieve a Palestinian state, or to reach a ceasefire, or even to get the humanitarian aid to the level that is needed, is very much hampered by the bigger players in that conflict, being Israel, being the United States, being Western European countries that are supportive of Israel when it comes to arming. And what we've seen from the GCC countries is that this difference didn't really have an impact on their relationships with either the United States, Europe, or Israel itself in a meaningful sense, meaning no cost, as it was mentioned in other panels and in other talks. The Abraham Accords are still there. Saudi Arabia has expressed that it is still interested in normalization, but it now has conditions that need to be met. It is still pursuing the same kind of formal commitment from the United States. So no cost was imposed or no consequences also in the relationship with the outside world that, to be honest, at some points, especially recently, those same powers that are the United States or Europe or Israel seem to be directly harming the interests and objectives of those Gulf countries. But we still haven't reached the moment where you see Gulf countries, sending a strong signal or taking an action to signal to the United States, okay, this needs to stop. We see them, like the case in Saudi Arabia, operating to further contain the consequences. So when it comes to the strikes on Yemen, whether by Israel or by the United States and the UK and other Western partners, Saudi Arabia tries to manage this from the Yemeni side, not from the US or European side, right? Tries to adapt to what the US is doing. And this honestly takes me to the idea that maybe it is the time to also work on the other side, to work on the Western policies, to work on the Israeli policies, and not just try to find the arrangements with Iran, with the Houthis, and among themselves to contain and shield the relationships from the consequences. Now, if you want me to, and I'll be brief, of course, to give my very dear friend Badr enough time, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, on October 6th and until October 6th, Saudi Arabia, when it comes to its foreign policy, did make Palestine part of its, if you want, deal or recalibrated relationship with the United States, right? But the difference to me after October 7th is that Saudi Arabia was not that much involved or interested to be involved, to be honest, in the internal political arrangements of how the Palestinian state is going to happen, who's going to govern Gaza. To Saudi Arabia, what was important was, the big lines of, I want a roadmap. After October 7th, now it has to be involved in those details. It has to be involved on how our Gaza and the West Bank are going to form one Palestinian state. Who's going to govern Gaza? What are we going to do with Hamas? How will the money of the reconstruction go, and towards what institution? And to me, that makes a big difference from a foreign policy that was very much focused before October 7th on in whatever serves internal interest, into getting more dragged into the details of the conflict.
Thank you, Yasmin. That's really interesting. And I think there are a few strands to pick up on. One, Yemen, which I think it's important to dig in a bit on. Yes, of course, Saudi Arabia is looking to move away from being a party to a peacemaker, but certainly its interests are being compromised with Houthi activity. And I struggle to understand, rationalize. I understand it, and I can see the rationality, but how you can make peace with players that are going to be destabilizing, not just now or in 6 months, but potentially for a longer period of time. And I think, that I'd like to dig in on, and then also just to pick up on what does working on the Western or the Israeli side maybe look like for Saudi Arabia or for Gulf states? I think that's quite interesting. And is it through pressure? Is it through support? What kind of work would you suggest? And I'll come back to you on that. But over to you, Badr. Great to have you, and great to have you as part of the Chatham House family. So you are a long time observer of Gulf politics. And I don't want you to just wear your Kuwait hat here, but of course you're welcome to bring in the Kuwaiti perspective, particularly in this moment. I think it's unique and as well. But how are you seeing the Gulf getting on? I mean, is it all positive? And are we in this sort of new Gulf moment? And is the Gulf managing some of these challenges as adeptly? Or, are there some sort of behind the curtain issues that you'd like to shed light on as well?
Thank you, Sanam. It's great to be part of the Chatham House family and to be in great company with my dear friend Yasmin and Dr. Abdel Khaliq. The way I see the region, the Gulf region, we cannot divorce it from the larger Middle East. And what I see in the larger Middle East is both a fragile and a fluid regional order. And what do I mean by that? By fragile, and I see the fragility coming from the larger Middle East and flowing with risks flowing into the Gulf region, and vice versa. I see fluidity as a primary order of things in the Gulf, with fragility being a secondary order that we need to keep mind of. By fragility, I'm looking at the various conflicts, non-ending conflicts really surrounding the Gulf region. Those are conflicts that are deep, simmered, and that have been evolving with various actors. Another layer of fragility is also the various components of socioeconomic failures that the countries around the region, more or less, have been facing for decades on. The right to dignified living for the average citizen in the larger Middle East, the right to housing, to jobs, to freedoms. That's been a challenge for the larger Middle East. And to add a third and final layer to this fragility, it's the human security component when it comes to common challenges that we all face, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to water scarcity, when it comes to food security. I think those are issues that we all grapple with as we move along in this fast-paced environment. Now, if you look into the Gulf proper, layers of that fragility may not be upon us, but the human security component when it comes to climate, food, and water are certainly there. And by fluidity, what I mean is there is that quick, agile, nimble feel in which red lines are being redrawn, the actors are being active and hypermobile in their motions. You cannot count on one specific position to remain static. You have to be on your tiptoes to understand how things are moving. And that in itself is a good thing, because it allows for the Gulf to lead on charge where others have failed in the region. Now, bringing both the fluid and fragile moment together is the centrality of Palestine to all parties involved. This has been an issue that's been ongoing for decades, and this has to end. And I think reflecting back on the Madrid summit back in 91, ironically, inadvertently, the Gulf states back then, at the backdrop of, the occupation and then liberation of Kuwait, have somehow indirectly led to that moment. And I think another such moment is upon us. And we need to think of not only the day after, but the decades after, not only for Palestine, but for all parties involved, as Yasmin has mentioned, because it's not only about us trying to fix things, it's about everyone looking into a grand reset and rethinking their positions and policies forward.
Thanks, Badr. That's a really, I think, inspiring vision. And I couldn't agree with you more in how you've sort of described the region. And I really like your employment of fluidity and fragility, and thank you for tapping in and raising the human security dynamics that too often are marginalized in the midst of military conflict. But certainly the region is fragile. There are a sort of blending of conflicts, and the impact on human security is, I think, really profound and widespread, and has clear challenges for the Gulf states. I think Yemen is quite obvious in terms of human security, but also in terms of climate, demographic explosion, over a longer period of time. Certainly all of this will bear fruit, but it doesn't extend. It doesn't stop at Yemen. It extends across Iran and Iraq and into Syria, which remains this black box that we're currently, of course, also not really paying enough attention to as well. So there is a lot there to pick up on. And I want to come back to each of you. I think we could keep doing this for quite some time, but let's start. And maybe you guys can pick up on each other's points, because I think this is really a fascinating discussion and probably grounds for a workshop at Chatham House. But Abdul Khalik, you know, you were very positive. You were very, which is good. I think too often, you know, we as analysts, or myself as an analyst, I focus on the negative because but you know, here we are, de-escalation is holding. Yasmin has also said that. How do we build on this positivity that you see? I mean, yes, the Abraham Accords are still there. The UAE is taking a very bold role, but so are other states. Qatar is playing its role. It's paying a price for its role. You know, everyone is working together. How do we continue to take that forward? And is there real meaningful support for this moment and for this collaboration? Let's say using Palestine as a glue for the time being. Can you maybe develop this a bit further and put some sort of substance to see how you see this evolving? Because of course, 9 months on, you know, what is the Arab vision for the day after? If Israel has no vision and the US hasn't really delivered a vision, certainly Arab states must know what they want and have an idea of how to get there. And of course, it's being discussed incrementally in the media. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, first, I fully agree with what Badr and Yasmin said on major things in here. But let me also elaborate and answer your question directly. Two things. One is that as difficult as this last 10-month war in Gaza has been on the human level, as Badr has mentioned, the cost has been really beyond belief. It is genocidal in a way. But I think the Gaza war is not going to be transformative or transformative in any sense of the world. I think things will pretty much, despite a few changes here and there, will stay the same. The right-wing politics in Israel will continue, and it will be even much more right-wing. That is not expected to change. Iran has always been a spoiler, whether we like it or not, and we have seen it. So that's not going to change. Hamas probably will be defeated, maybe, relatively speaking, but Hamas will be there. It's not going to go away politically for sure, and to some extent even militarily. I don't see in the near future two-state solutions coming on board. Israel is against it, and there is no appetite for it, definitely among this right-wing government. So all in all, I think once this war is over, things will go back as it is. Yes, fragile, but nevertheless, all countries in the region are very flexible, very adaptable. They know how to adapt to the new realities that comes out of this Gaza war. This is definitely true of the Arab Gulf states, by the way. They are ready for the day after. And let me just tell you what the Emiratis are doing, at least, and the other Arab Gulf states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Yasmin probably will fill us on this. I think they are preparing for the day after on three fronts. One is on the security. There is a need to keep that place secure after this war and after the Israelis are done with this genocide war. So there's a lot of thinking there, and UAE has a plan, and it has discussed it with Israel, with Palestinian authorities, with the American, and with Arab countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar. Second, there is a need for the political track for the day after, and the UAE and the Arab Gulf states are also working on the politics of it. We need a new Palestinian government, a new prime minister. We also probably need a new Israeli government. Hopefully that the Israelis have to do their share, that accept probably a two-state solution in the long run. And third, and the most important issue that the Arab Gulf states are working on, and certainly the UAE is taking the lead, is the relief issue. We are faced with 2 million refugees. It is disaster. Gaza has been obliterated beyond belief and beyond recognition. So there is a need for relief. So there is a lot that the Arab Gulf states are doing it in close cooperation with moderate states such as Jordan, such as Iran, such as Egypt, such as Morocco. And I think, just to sum up this, I think, yes, it is a disaster what we're seeing there, but I don't think much is going to change on the long run. There are a few changes here and there, small ones, but really not significant, not radical changes. It's not going to be a different world after this war ends, Salam.
Okay, thank you for your realism. Of course, if nothing is really going to change, that of course is fertile ground for a country like Iran and for the axis of resistance to continue to play a spoiler role. And one of the arguments for a dramatic and innovative change on this issue of Palestine is to close down a conflict in a legitimate way, to close down the opportunity for countries like Iran to be spoilers. But we can come back to that. Yasmin, over to you on two issues. We're sort of veering into some of the questions that are coming in, but one is Yemen. Talk me through the rationalization process on making an arrangement with the Houthis and this political process that seems to still be the only lifeline to ending this war. How do you think that the Saudi government is going to manage the Houthi presence on their border, not just for the coming months, but over a longer period of time? Is there a plan or a strategy there, or is this just tactics? And slowly, they hope to sort of shift allegiances and develop a bit more trust and diversify the Houthi ties with countries like Iran, but also Hezbollah and the like.
So at least, again, I like when I talk about the foreign policy of a country to put it within all of the foreign policy, because it's not, you cannot just talk about just Yemen or just the relationship with Turkey, because it is the same decision maker who's taking the decisions across all the board, right? And when it comes to Yemen, again, if you remember before October 7th attacks, there was a very strong and clear Saudi determination to extricate Saudi Arabia from this war and to find an arrangement with the Houthis. And it was always, every day we heard, yeah, it's going to be tomorrow, a deal is going to be declared. And then the day after, it's tomorrow. And then the war happened. And then the Houthis started attacking the Red Sea and attacking Israel. I do believe that the Saudi position hasn't changed, because this is the number one priority for Saudi Arabia that came even before, Israel-Palestine. It was really to put an end to this costly war, to the threat that it represents to Saudi Arabia, especially given that we have seen now the military capabilities that the Houthis have. And they have proven to be, to not to commit to their words with the slightest changes in circumstances. And so the longer Saudi Arabia waits, the riskier and more costly it becomes to have this kind of arrangement or deal with the Houthis. Let's also remind ourselves that, that Yemen issue was the number one issue discussed between Iran and Saudi Arabia when they decided to resume diplomatic relations in Beijing. It was, yes, mainly about bilateral relations, about détente, but Yemen was, I would say a first test. I remember having a conversation with you like a couple of years ago, and I told you Yemen is going to be the test that shows it will fail, because, and this is what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the limits of making Yemen the first case study, but still the détente is going on, because I think Saudi Arabia has adjusted its, if you want, expectations from Iran and from the Houthis themselves, and have concluded this deal with the Houthis that still is being updated every day because of Gaza, to those expectations. That, and this is to your point, is this tactical or this is on the long run? I don't think Saudi Arabia can afford for peace with Yemen to be a tactical thing for now, and then we resume the attacks and the wars later. I think, and that's the same logic with which it deals with Gaza, by the way. I think Saudi Arabia is 100% focused on Vision 2030, and everything it does in the region and beyond has as a starting point of making this vision work and protecting those colossal projects that some of them are on the Red Sea. It has development projects in the south as well. It wants to become a logistical hub. So I believe that the arrangement with the Houthi was seen to be kind of, at least at the beginning, a short run to test, but with every willingness to make this work on the long run, including through the involvement of China, including through the involvement of Iran.
Thank you, Yasmin. And you've laid that out quite clearly. And I think I very much agree with you. Yemen as the first case study is a risky but necessary venture. But maybe Saudi Arabia has Iran also in a difficult position. And we can talk about that in a minute. Badr, over to you. And let me just ask you very directly. I mean, obviously, the Gulf is by no means a homogeneous entity. There are divisions across the Gulf. And we sort of laid that out in the outset. But you know, are certain countries doing a better job at managing Israel versus Iran? Is that what the Gulf is going to be doing going forward? Or you know, is this sort of this ad hoc moment where normalization will continue for some states and on the other hand, a de-escalation will continue for other states? How are you seeing things? I mean, Abdul Khalik says that, you know, there is not going to be a two-state at the end. And so is that going to be okay for Gulf security at the end? I realize I just threw a lot at you. So again, pick up what you will.
Let me start by thinking along perceptions. And the more that we have alignment in perceptions, then we can have a better flow of ideas and solutions forward. And I think what's missing currently in the discussion or in the general discussion in the region is that we are truly living in a regional war. I mean, some are trying to, you know, buck the trend and say these are limited strikes, but we've gone through unprecedented moves in the last few months alone. A direct attack from Iran to Israel, though symbolic, you know, calculated, preempted, whatever word you want to use, it still happened. And the same thing goes for a direct Israeli attack on Yemen or Hudaydah. So the more that this moves on, the more that there is pressure on the Gulf states to adapt and to move a fine line, and that will prove to be challenging with time. Now, let me give them credit, and the credit is due where it is because they're not getting as much credit as they should when it comes to aligning their foreign policies to meet their domestic needs. And I agree with Yasmin here. This has been the #1 priority across the Gulf states. How can we allow for the foreign policy of each given state to push for the domestic needs of the country and its citizens? You certainly saw in the last few months a major development, even if it came probably a few decades late, but we do have now a document that we can refer to as the GCC regional vision for security. And that in itself is somewhat of an achievement. Yes, it needs further workshopping, it needs further detailing, but that needs to be seen. And in terms of your direct question on how the Gulf states have been managing this, look, I think they're dividing and conquering. And you can take the last few months as an example. The UAE pushing hard through its UNSC seat up until late December, and those pushes were very innovative and calculated and organized. You see a high mediation front from the Qatari side, and the quiet but nonetheless powerful Saudi insistence on pushing for the symbolic recognition of the state of Palestine. Saudi foreign policy has worked really hard to get those different European states on board, and they're not getting enough credit for it. So I think moving forward, it's dividing and conquering, alignment between our different visions of the region, and then trying to fit in those specific foreign policies to meet the domestic needs.
Thank you, Badr. That was really clear and concise as usual. Dr. Abdul Khalik, I'm going to start turning to some of the questions that are coming in. And there's one that I think all of you actually can pick up on, and I hope that you might. Yes? Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, jump in just for two quick comments here.
Yes.
Well, I think I tend to disagree with you most of the time, but this time even more, if you allow me, Sanam. You guys in particular tend to overemphasize divisions among the Arab Gulf states. I think that is something that is, there are differences, but divisions are probably too strong of a word. I have never seen these 6 Arab Gulf states so much into coordinating their moves towards whether it's Iran or whether it's now Palestine, whether it's Gaza, whether it is reaching out. I think there is a whole lot of cooperation and coordination that we have not seen probably in years, especially after the boycott of Qatar has gone. So that's one thing I like to definitely make a point of and disagree with you on it. I think second point I like to make here is that, yes, these are 6 different states, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, each with its own priorities when it comes to regional and domestic. But I think, these 6 Gulf states agree on the minimum of what is needed to deal with regional problems, especially when it comes to Iran. To them all, Iran is a security threat. That has been the case for the past 40 plus years. Now, how to deal with this security threat probably varies between now and then and from one country to other. Some are more dose, some are more hawkish on this. But we also agree on this, and every communique coming out of GCC summit meeting put Iran as #1 threat, and there is at least 10 different articles about how to deal with Iran. So they agree on the minimum of it. So please, let's not really emphasize the divisions that is there, rightly so, but doesn't need to be exaggerated.
I don't think they're being exaggerated, but happy to clarify. I think that these are divisions that have also longstanding been there on tactics. And until the tactics are aligned, obviously, that can pose challenges across the region. So people like me, analysts who call out the divisions, and I think I'm not unique, are doing so to press Gulf states, above all, to coordinate tactically to prevent that kind of divisive and opportunistic policy that Iran has proven to be relatively effective at. But let me come to a separate point that has come in, and I think it's an interesting one for across the Gulf, but in the UAE in particular. How is public sentiment being navigated and managed with regards to the war in Gaza and support for Palestine? And the accords are holding, and the Emirati government has made it abundantly clear that they see interests in keeping the accords alive as well. How are people navigating this? How is this being digested? And more importantly, perceptions, I think, are oftentimes not coming out. How is the public also seeing regional dynamics by your vantage point? Here you have the war continuing 9 months on. The axis of resistance is trying to coordinate transnationally, but at the same time, we're not in a regional war, which I suppose is positive. Although maybe we're not calling it a regional war, as Badr is saying. Maybe we're pretending it's not quite a regional war, but we're certainly crossing unprecedented thresholds. If you might want to draw in public perceptions or from your own observations, I'd be grateful. I think people would be happy to hear them.
Well, anti-Israel manifestation is at all-time high. Anti-Israeli feelings is just beyond belief. It has never been worse. And it is true throughout the Arab Gulf states, including the Arab world, and you've seen it throughout world capital. So there is an anti-Israeli feeling that we have not seen at any previous times. Anti-American feelings is also at all-time high. So that is true. Regardless of this, regardless of the Arab streets feelings and reaction or lack of reaction, the government have maintained. Ibrahim Accord government, the 4 or the 5 of them, have maintained the relationship, and none of them have decided to break a relationship, or even recall ambassadors. So that's for necessity. And believe it or not, there is more coordination today between Israel and many of these Arab Abraham Accord or states that normalize with Israel than even before the Gaza war. Definitely on the intelligence sharing, there is a whole lot that is being done. Definitely in human relief. Every single day, there is plenty of contact between different committees in Israel and Jordan and Egypt and United Arab Emirates to send relief. There's definitely more contact between Qatar and Israel directly this time, even if they don't have security. So there's a lot going on, despite the fact that there is this public outrage and even government outrage against the suicidal war. So there is disconnect maybe, but what is compensating, at least in the case of the UAE, is that the UAE is the foremost country when it comes to providing relief for the Palestinians in Gaza, and that is keeping people quiet and happy to see the UAE doing its share when it comes to relief and putting the Abraham Accord to the best use at this juncture, and maybe even in the future. That is where now the Abraham Accord, if it wasn't for the Abraham Accord, we would not have seen a field hospital in Gaza from the UAE side. So I think, Abraham Accord is here to stay, and that is why I believe this Gaza war is not going to change much. And it's not definitely going to change the fact that the Gulf states will remain as they are today, the center of activity in the region.
Thank you. Yasmin, let's turn to, you've been writing on Saudi-Iran dynamics, and you've also referenced it in the context of Yemen. I'm curious to hear your view on how things are going. Obviously, you've indicated that there are troubles on the Yemen file, but things are, contained and continuing. Yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke at the U.S. Congress, and he spoke about the creation of an Abraham alliance, not just normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, in exchange for peace, depending on the price, depending on where we are within the U.S. Political system and investment. And Saudi Arabia was party to the April 13th CENTCOM-led coalition to respond and push back against Iran's missiles, contained or uncontained, all sorts of views on this. How is Saudi Arabia seeing Iran? Here we have July 26th, 5th. In a few days, a new Iranian president is going to be inaugurated. We have a reformist coming back into power, or reformist in name only. Maybe I would appreciate if you could sort of sketch out how you see Saudi Arabia positioning itself vis-a-vis Iran. It's clearly indicated it's interested in the U.S. It's clearly offered itself a normalization with Israel, but at the same time, is it joining an Abraham alliance against Iran? How do you see this playing out?
So again, I'm glad that you asked me the question from the Saudi point of view, as I read it, as I research it, as I study it, because honestly, it's different from when you read the Israeli press and hear the statements, and then it's different when you read the American. And believing the Israeli and American statements, Saudi Arabia normalized relations with Israel and threw Palestinians under the bus 2 years ago. But it hasn't happened, right? So I find it hard to believe that Saudi Arabia would join some kind of Abraham alliance with Israel. One reason for it is, one, of course, you have the Saudi statements publicly and privately saying that it is, yes, it is about the Palestinians, but it's also about Saudi interest. What interest does Saudi Arabia have in having this conflict erupt in this way every year? Again, this is a country that is investing hundreds of billions, if not thousands of billions of dollars in building projects and building itself. And we have seen how, as Badr alluded, we now have a link, but the Houthis have an office in Iraq and coordinating and are promising to reach all the way to the Mediterranean. So from a Saudi point of view, it is not just about championing, it's really about very hardcore interests. Now, when it comes to Iran, I think we have seen, as in the case of the UAE, that even Iran is willing to be pragmatic about this relationship with Israel. And for as long as Saudi Arabia keeps the position of no use of territory or airspace to target Iran, I mean, Saudi airspace or Saudi territory to target Iran, I think, and you know this better than I do, Sanam, honestly, you could replace the three of us, is that Iran are going to accept in a very pragmatic way a relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, the very moment of the attack and counterattack between Israel and Iran really showcased how much stress the Gulf countries, and particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are stretched very thin right now. What Saudi Arabia did on that day, one, was part of its commitments towards CENTCOM, towards the United States, of showing that they are a good partner to the United States and to the Western countries, hoping that in reaction, they will receive the same kind of support if the Houthi, or sometimes it's a question of when, target them again, like in 2019. Two, in that very specific instance, Sanam, I think it was, I'll say it in French, it's a chronique d'une mort annoncée. It means it was completely stretched out before. The Iranians warned everyone, everybody was prepared. And so Saudi Arabia was just helping in containing this conflict, not to escalate. The two foreign ministers of Iran and Saudi Arabia spoke before, they spoke after. Now, does this mean that Saudi Arabia thinks that the relationship with Iran since March 2023 is going great? Of course not, because good neighborliness means that you shield your neighbor and you don't send shipments of arms, you don't put a ship in the Red Sea to help the Houthis continue the attack. So of course not, and this is why we still haven't moved from the détente phase to a real cooperation phase, right, where you have projects of cooperation being implemented. But I don't think the Saudi Arabia is going to give up on the détente with Iran soon. We have seen it in the funerals of the foreign minister and the president of Iran. Saudi Arabia not only sent Prince Faisal bin Farhan, but also sent a personal envoy and personal advisor to the king. So I think this is going to continue, especially that I don't think that the perception that Saudi Arabia cannot 100% rely on the United States either in protecting it or in curtailing and taming a bit the Israeli sense of insecurity that urges Israel to target Iran. I think the Saudis don't think they can count on the US when it comes to these two elements 100%. So there is still, and also from the Iranian side, I'm sure you saw the two articles that the new president published, there is still that willingness to continue in this détente.
Thank you, Yasmin. That was also very clear. And thank you also for bringing up the magic word that we haven't discussed for 53 minutes, the United States. So it's time, Badr. You have two questions coming for you. One from the audience. Gentleman is asking why Kuwait, that has had such a vocal and notable role in speaking out about Gaza and Palestine, why has Kuwait's advocacy been diminished? He's troubled by this sort of apparent retreat from an assertive foreign policy stance. Is this a shift that is going to be long-standing? If you could comment on that, I would be grateful. And specifically, I would like you to also comment on the US election and how, if at all, you see the outcome, which again is potentially uncertain, impacting maybe specific or generally countries across the Gulf. There is an assumption that Gulf states are happy for President Trump to come back and we're going to go for a Trump 2.0. Is that what you think? Is that how you see things?
It's quite telling that the United States only came up at minute 53. And I think this reflects the sentiment of the US within the Gulf. We cannot count on the US to continue its traditional role because that role has been changing. The Gulf states have been changing. And I think there is a mutual acceptance that this needs to be the norm moving forward. We're taking on responsibility of the region, and this is a welcome responsibility. And the US needs to adapt and listen to its partners. First and foremost being the Gulf states, who I think were reliable partners across the decades. Now, trust me, whether it's the Democrat administration or the Republican one, the Gulf states will be able to manage We've managed the different ones in the past, having the national interests of the Gulf states first and foremost come through, and this will be communicated across. I think there has been that clear communication when it comes to how China assembles itself and presents itself in the region, and that I think we're beyond that. There is no sensitivity to having a Chinese partner on various fronts in the Gulf region. And let me tell you, what America needs to do, and that's where we're looking at it the most, is act responsibly when it comes to Palestine. Because if it wasn't for the US, none of this massacre that's taking place and the ethnic cleansing that's moving forward would continue. It's being bankrolled by their weaponry. And, you saw the performance that happened yesterday in Congress, and that was something that speaks to where the US political establishment is in terms of that field. And they need to think of how their partners in the Gulf think about that file, which is Palestine. Now, when it comes to Kuwait, I would disagree with that notion that Kuwait is retreating. Kuwait is going through a transition of its own. That transition had probably made it look inwards, and that may seem as if it's retreating from certain files like Palestine, but it's fully in coordination with its Gulf partners when it comes to the centrality of bringing in a Palestinian state, of salvaging Palestinian blood. This has not changed. The humanitarian push has not changed, nor have the political statements have moved. Can I comment on Iran and Israel very quickly? I agree with Dr. Abdel Khaliq. I think of all files where we stand today, when it comes to our vision towards Iran, it has been the most aligned in years, really. And I think this is a message to Iran to start to think of modifying its behavior to cater to this Gulf détente that's taking place with Iran. Where there is a difference among the Gulf states, I think, is in our handling of the Israel file. But the beauty of the GCC in that sense, and some see it as a weakness, I see it as a strength, is that the GCC as a body accommodates differences towards certain policy files. Because in this difference, there could be a concerted effort to bring something productive through one route or another.
If I can just to add to this, we are definitely in a moment where Iran has an opportunity to seize. Because as you saw, there is a recent normalization, even with Bahrain, which remained as the only country that hadn't normalized relations with Iran. And I think as much as I talked at the beginning about working also with the West to curb or to stop for a ceasefire, but also to curb Israeli impulses to expand the war to Lebanon, to expand it, to hit in Iraq, in Syria, but also Iran itself. In some case, I think they also need to use this leverage with Iran. That this is a moment that Iran should seize, where the 6 Gulf countries have formulated a vision that is actually outlooking, right? Saying here is our frame for cooperating with our neighbors. And I think they should make it clear to Iran that this is not an opportunity that is going to last forever.
Yes, I think those are all very good points. And Abdel Khaliq, I'm coming back to you right now. Perhaps if you want to pick up on this, and also because the UAE has been at the sort of forefront of its outreach towards Iran, I'm keen to have you make a comment, but also to ask you about one issue that continues to come up in the chat about Sudan. We reference very briefly about conflicts blending and bleeding into other geographies. And Sudan is actually one of these arenas where there isn't Gulf unity. And in fact, we know that there are dynamics with competing Gulf interests in Sudan, and the UAE, of course, is a active player in that conflict. So, perhaps you can walk us through how Gulf states can become united in Sudan, or at least make clear what the Emirati objectives are there as we close.
Well, let me go back to the Trump question, your 53 seconds, 53 minutes question on Trump. Look, there is, as Badr have said, and we all more or less agree, there is a new Gulf. There is the 21st century Gulf. And this new Gulf is much more independent than the Gulf of the past. And the West world capital, whether it's Washington, Paris, etc., have to recognize, have to reconcile with the fact that there is a new independent Gulf. And this new independent Gulf does not necessarily take order from Washington or from any capital. Their interest is there, and it is foremost important than any other things, okay? So the Gulf is no longer as it used to be. It does not take order from Washington one way or the other, and we have seen that materialize time and again. So when it comes to dealing with Trump or with any other president, whether it's Harris or Trump, the Gulf states have dealt with something like 12, 13, 14 different presidents over the past 70 years. And they have been very successful to adapting to whether Republican or Democratic president. So we have been very good at managing our relationship despite the different presidents that we had to deal with for the past 70 years. I think what is happening is whether it's going to be Trump or it's going to be Harrison, generally speaking, the Gulf states are happier with Republican presidents than Democrat. That's one general rule, by the way. Republicans have been better in dealing with this, and we have been better with the Republican president. And here, probably Trump falls in, as unpredictable he has, but we got to know him for 4 years, and we know how to work with him. He made the point to come to Riyadh before any other capital in the world, and that's a very important gesture, by the way. We'll never forget that at all. So whether it's Trump or Harris, they have to just reconcile with the fact that Gulf capitals these days are not going to just budge and take order from Washington. So that's the question on America and Trump coming back. On Sudan, I think the facts are like this when it comes to Sudan. Who started this war? It is Burhan and the army. Who insists on not stopping this war despite all the good efforts by the Gulf, by Saudi Arabia, by everybody else? It's the Sudanese army. Who is, at the moment being boycotted by every single, more or less, African states, especially the African unity? It is the army. I think we just have to realize that the party that is really doing bad service to the Sudan is internal. It is the army. It's the military in general, and we have done our job to try to de-escalate, but it's not going through, and the blame should not be shifted to any outside actor, be it the UAE or any other, but we have to focus on the fact that it is an internal domestic Sudanese, and the military is the problem, and everybody has to help, and the UAE is trying its best to do its best. And all this allegation about UAE being a supporter of this party or the other Sudanese party is just simply allegation. UAE has denied it all. What I know, there is a great deal of discussion, great deal of conversation between the Arab Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and I don't see much of a conflict between them. Maybe tactical differences there, but the agenda is the same. Bring more order, stability to a country that deserves to be more stable.
Thank you, Dr. Abdelkhalik.
I will disagree, but I will not add anything.
I will give you 30 seconds. 30 seconds, Yasmin. 30 seconds.
I think if it was as simple as this, the conflict would have been solved by now. I don't think it is that simple, and I don't believe that there is agreement. Where there is now, we are at a point where maybe there's a broad agreement that it should stop. But how and who did what and who's doing what, I think there's a very strong disagreement, without throwing accusations at anyone here, to be very honest, because I don't think anyone is in the place to throw any accusation on any country.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think this is a separate discussion, one that we will certainly pick up on, because I think there are nuances to this. And while this is you know, we could keep going very clearly. I want to thank you all. What has really struck me is that there are some big themes that we are, I think, in general aligned on. And I think taking those big themes and analyzing them further and playing out further is really interesting and really important about this Gulf moment. Yes, there's unity on strategy, their unity on priorities, obviously tactical differences in how things are being applied, but this is a moment that continues and one that we have to continue to watch. This is a moment that, you know, if Iran isn't listening or is not understanding, it will lose the opportunity of this moment, and I think that's something to capitalize on. Israel also might lose the opportunity of this moment, and I'm always struck by how overly confident Israel is in this moment and thinking that the Gulf will still be there after this, the Sunnis, as they like to call them, everyone in the region. And then thirdly, you know, the message to Washington is very much there, and I think it should be heard quite loudly and clearly. But sadly, you know, different capitals interpret messages in different ways. I'm remiss that we did not have an opportunity to take on the UK and what a new UK government would mean for Gulf or Europe more broadly. But I think we will park that for the next time. And hopefully the next time we will be together in person. So Bader, Yasmin, Abdul Khalik, thank you. You've brought immense wealth of expertise and analysis to this discussion. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to everyone online for participating and staying with us. And we look forward to having you again in the near future. Take care and stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sana.